Chapter 25 of The Bartlett Mystery by Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Flank attacks. Somewhat tired, having ridden that day to Poughkeepsie and back, Petch nevertheless put up a great race after the fleeing motor car. His muscles were rejuvenated by Polly Barnard's exciting news, and no less by admiration for the girl herself. Little thinking that Jim, the plumber, was performing deeds of derring-do in the hall of Gateway House, he congratulated himself on the lucky chance which enabled him to oblige the fair Polly. He dashed into the road to Hoboken, and found, to his joy, that the dust raised by the passage of the car gave an unfailing clue to its route. Now, a well-regulated motorcycle can run rings round any other form of automobile, no matter how many horses may be pent in the cylinders, if on an ordinary road and subjected to the exigencies of traffic. Vowles, a breakneck driver though he was, dared not disregard the traffic regulations and risk a smash-up. He got the best out of his engine, but was compelled to go steadily through clusters of houses and around tree-shaded corners. To his great amazement, as he was tearing through the last habitations before crossing the New Jersey flats, he was hailed loudly from behind. "Hi, you! Pull up!" He glanced over his shoulder. A motorcyclist, white with dust, was riding after him with tremendous energy. "Hola!" cried Vowles, snatching another look. "What's the matter?" Petch should have temporized, done one of 100 things he thought of too late, but he was so breathless after the terrific sprint in which he overtook Vowles that he blurted out, "I know you! You can't escape! There's the girl herself! I see her!" Hell! Vowles, urged on the car by foot and finger, after him pelted Petch with set teeth and straining eyes. The magnificent car, superb in its energies, swept through the night like the fiery dragon of song and fable, but with a speed never attained by dragon yet, else there would be room on earth for nothing save dragons. And the motorcycle leaped and bounded close behind, stuttering its resolve to conquer the monster in front. The pair created a great commotion as they whirred past scattered houses and emerged into the keen, cold air of the marshland. A few cars met en route actually slowed up, and heads were thrust out to peer in wonder. Women in them were scared, and enjoined drivers to be careful, while men explained laughingly that a couple of joy riders were being chased by a motor cop. It was neck or nothing now for Vowles, and when these alternatives offered, he never hesitated as to which should be chosen. He knew he was in desperate case. The pace, the extraordinary appearance of a hatless man and a girl with her hair streaming wild, for Winifred's abundant tresses had soon shed all restraints of pins and twists before the tearing wind of their transit, would create a tumult in Hoboken. Something must be done. He must stop the car and shoot that pestiferous cyclist, who had sprung out of the ground as though one of Medusa's teeth had lain buried there throughout the ages, and become a panoplied warrior at a woman's cry. He looked ahead. There was no car in sight. He peered over his shoulder. There was no cyclist. Petch had not counted on this frenzied race, and his petrol tank was empty. He had pulled up disconsolately half a mile away, and was now borrowing a gallon of gas from an orange-bound car explaining excitedly that he was after a murderer. Voles laughed. The fiend's luck, which seldom fails the fiend's votaries, had come to his aid in a highly critical moment. There remained Winifred. She, too, must be dealt with. Now, all who have experienced the effect of an anesthetic will understand that after the merely stupefying power of the gas has waned, there follows a long period of semi-hysteria, when actual existence is dreamlike and impressions of events evanescent. Winifred, therefore, hardly appreciated what was taking place until the car stopped abruptly, and the stupor of cold passed almost simultaneously with the stupor of anesthesia. But Voles had his larger plan now. With coolness and daring he might achieve it. All depended on the discretion of those left behind in Gateway House. It was impossible to keep Winifred always in durance, or to prevent her everlastingly from obtaining help. That fool of a cyclist, for instance, had he contented himself with riding quietly behind until he reached the ferry, would have wrecked the exploit beyond repair. There remained one last move, but it was a perfect one in most ways. Would Fowl keep his mouth shut? Voles cursed Fowl in his thought. Were it not for Fowl, there would have been no difficulty. Carshaw would never have met Winifred, and the girl would have been as wax in the hands of Rachel Craik. He caught hold of Winifred's arm. "If you scream, I'll choke you," he said fiercely. Shaken by the chloroform mixture, benumbed as the outcome of an unprotected drive, the girl was physically, as well as mentally, unable to resist. He coiled her hair into a knot, gagged her dexterously with a silk handkerchief — Voles knew all about gags — and tied her hands behind her back with a shoelace. Then he adjusted the hood and side screens. He did these things hurriedly, but without fumbling. He was losing precious minutes, for the telephone wire might yet throttle him. But the periods of waiting at the ferry, and while crossing the Hudson, must be circumvented in some way or other. His last act, before starting the car, was to show Winifred the revolver he never lacked. "See this?" he growled in her ear. "I'm not going to be held by any cop. At the least sign of a move by you to attract attention, I'll put the first bullet through the cop, the second through you, and the third through myself, if I can't make my getaway. Better believe that. I mean it." He asked for no token of understanding on her part. He was stating only the plain facts. In a word, Voles was born to be a great man, and an unhappy fate had made him a scoundrel. But fortune still befriended him. Rain fell as he drove through Hoboken. The ferry was almost deserted, and the car was wedged in between two huge mail vans on board the boat. Hardened rascal though he was, Voles breathed a sigh of relief as he drove unchallenged past a uniformed policeman on arriving at Christopher Street. He guessed his escape was only a matter of minutes. In reality, he was gone some 10 seconds when the policeman was called to the phone. As for Petch, that valorous knight-errant crossed on the next boat, and the Hoboken police were already on the qui-vive. Every road into and out of New York was soon watched by sharp eyes on the lookout for a car bearing a license numbered in the tens of thousands, and tenanted by a hatless man and a girl in indoor costume. Quickly the circles lessened in concentric rings through the agencies of telephone boxes and roundsmen. At 9:30, A patrolman found a car answering the description standing outside an uptown saloon on the east side. Examining the register number, he saw at once that blacking had been smeared over the first and last figures. Then he knew, but there was no trace of the driver. Bowles and Winifred had vanished into thin air. Mrs. Carshaw, breakfasting with a haggard and weary son, revealed that Senator Michaeljohn was at Atlantic City. He kissed her for the news. "Michaeljohn must wait, mother," he said. "Winifred is somewhere in New York. I cannot tear myself away to Atlantic City today. When I have found her, I shall deal with Michaeljohn." Then came Steingall, and he and Mrs. Carshaw exchanged a glance which the younger man missed. Mrs. Carshaw, sitting a while in deep thought after the others had gone, rang up a railway company. Atlantic City is 4 hours distant from New York. By hurrying over certain inquiries she wished to make, she might catch a train at midday. She drove to her lawyer's. At her request, a smart clerk was lent to her for a couple of hours. They consulted various records. The clerk made many notes on foolscap sheets in a large round hand, and Mrs. Carshaw, seated in the train, read them many times through her gold-mounted lorgnette. It was 5 o'clock when a taxi brought her to the Marlborough Blenheim Hotel, and Senator Michaeljohn was the most astonished man on the Jersey coast at the moment when she entered unannounced, for Mrs. Carshaw had simply said to the elevator boy, "Take me to Senator Michaeljohn's sitting room." Undeniably, he was startled, but playing desperately for high stakes had steadied him somewhat. Perhaps the example of his stronger brother had some value, too, for he rose with sufficient affability. "What a pleasant rencontre, Mrs. Carshaw," he said. "I had no notion you were within 100 miles of the boardwalk." "That is not surprising," she answered, sinking into a comfortable chair. "I have just arrived. Order me some sandwiches and a cup of tea. I'm famished." He obeyed. "I take it you have come to see me," he said, quietly enough, though aware of a queer fluttering about the region of his heart. "Yes, I am so worried about Rex." "Dear me, the girl?" "It is always a woman. How you men must loathe us in your sane moments, if you ever have any." "I flatter myself that I am sane. Yet how could I say that I loathe your sex, Mrs. Carshaw?" "I wonder if your flattery will bear analysis. But there, no serious talk until I am refreshed. Do ring for some biscuits. Sandwiches are apt to be slow in the cutting." Thus, by pretext, she kept him from direct converse until a tea-tray, with a film of pâté de foie gras coyly hidden in thin bread and butter, formed, as it were, a rampart between them. "How did you happen on my address?" he asked, smilingly. It was the first shell of real warfare, and she answered in kind. "That was quite easy. The people at the Detective Bureau know it." The words hit him like a bullet. "The Bureau?" he cried. "Yes. The officials there are interested in the affairs of Winifred Marchbanks." He went ashen grey, but essayed nevertheless to turn emotion into mere amazement. He was far too clever a man to pretend a blank negation. The situation was too strenuous for any species of ostrich device. "I seem to remember that name," he said slowly, moistening his lips with his tongue. "Of course you do. You have never forgotten it. Let us have a friendly chat about her, Senator. My son is going to marry her. That is why I am here." She munched her sandwiches and sipped her tea, This experienced woman of the world, now boldly declared on the side of romance, was far too astute to force the man to desperation unless it was necessary. He must be given breathing time, permitted to collect his wits. She was sure of her ground. Her case was not legally strong. Michael John would discover that defect, and indeed it was not her object to act legally. If others could plot and scheme, she would have a finger in the pie, that was all. And behind her was the clear brain of Steingall, who had camped for days near the senator in Atlantic City, and had advised the mother how to act for her son. There was a long silence. She ate steadily. "Perhaps you will be good enough to state explicitly why you are here, Mrs. Carshaw," said Michael John at last. She caught the ring of defiance in his tone. She smiled. There was to be verbal sword play, and she was armed cap à pie. "Just another cup of tea," she pleaded, and he wriggled uneasily in his chair. The delay was torturing him. She unrolled her big sheets of notes. He looked over at them with well-simulated indifference. "I have an engagement," he began, looking at his watch. "You must put it off," she said with sudden heat. "The most important engagement of your life is here, now, in this room, William Michael John. I mentioned the Detective Bureau when I entered. Which do you prefer to encounter, me or an emissary of the police?" He paled again. Evidently this society lady had claws, and would use them if annoyed. "I do not think that I have said anything to warrant such language to me," he murmured, striving to smile deprecatingly. He succeeded but poorly. "You sent me to drive out into the world the girl whom my son loved," was the retort. "You made a grave mistake in that. I recognized her after a little while. I knew her mother. Now, am I to go into details?" "I really I Very well. 18 years ago, your brother, Ralph Vane Michaeljohn, murdered a man named Marchbanks, who had discovered that you and your brother were defrauding his wife of funds held by your bank as her trustees. I have here the records of the crime. I do not say that your brother, who has since been a convict and is now assisting you under the name of Ralph Voles, could be charged with that crime. Maybe murderer is too strong a word for him where Marchbanks was concerned, but I do say that any clever lawyer could send you and him to the penitentiary for robbing a dead woman and her daughter, the girl whom you and he have kidnapped within the last week." Here was a broadside with a vengeance. Michael John could not have endured a keener agony were he facing a judge and jury. It was one thing to have borne this terrible secret gnawing at his vitals during long years, but it was another to find it pitilessly laid bare by a woman belonging to that very society for which he had dared so much in order to retain his footing. He bent his head between his hands. For a few seconds thoughts of another crime danced in his surcharged brain, but Mrs. Carshaw's well-bred syllables brought him back to sanity with chill deliberateness. "Shall I go on?" she said. "Shall I tell you of Rachel Bartlett, of the scandal to be raised about your ears, not only by this falsified trust, but by the outrageous attack on Ronald Tower?" He raised his pallid face. He was a proud man, and resented her merciless taunts. "Of course," he muttered, "I deny everything you have said. But if it were true, You must have some ulterior motive in approaching me. What is it?" "I am glad you see that. I am here to offer terms." "Name them." "You must place this girl, Winifred Marchbanks, under my care, where she will remain until my son marries her, and make restitution of her mother's property." "No doubt you have a definite sum in your mind?" "Most certainly. My lawyers tell me you ought to refund the interest as well, but Winifred may content herself with the principal. You must hand her $500,000. He sprang to his feet, livid. "Woman," he yelled, "you are crazy!" Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Bartlett Mystery, by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Biter Bit. Mrs. Carshaw focused him again through her gold-rimmed eyeglasses. "Crazy?" she questioned calmly. "Not a bit of it. Merely an old woman bargaining for her son. Rex would not have done it. After thrashing you, he would have left you to the law, and, were the law to step in, you would surely be ruined. I, on the other hand, do not scruple to compound a felony. That is what my lawyers call it. My extravagance and carelessness have contributed to encumber Rex's estates with a heavy mortgage. If I provide his wife with a dowry which pays off the mortgage, and leaves her a nice sum as pin money, I shall have done well." "500,000! I repudiate your statements. Even if I did not, I have no such sum at command." "Yes, you have, or will have, which is the same thing. Shall I give you details of the Costa Rica cotton concession, arranged between you and Jacob and Helen Tower? They're here. As for repudiation, perhaps I have hurried matters. Permit me to go through my story at some length, quoting chapter and verse." She spread open her papers again, after having folded them. "Stop this wretched farce!" he almost screamed, for her coolness broke up his never too powerful nervous system. "If I agree, what guarantee is there? Ah, now you're talking reasonably. I can ensure the acceptance of my terms. First, where is Winifred?" He hesitated. Here was the very verge of the gulf. Any admission implied the truth of Mrs. Carshaw's words. She did not help him. He must take the plunge without any further impulsion. But the senator's nerves were broken. They both knew it. "At Gateway House, East Orange," he said sullenly. "I must tell you that my brother is a daredevil. Better leave me to—" "I am glad you have told the truth," she interrupted. "She is not at Gateway House now. Rex and a detective were there last night. There was a fight. Your brother, the resourceful scoundrel, evidently, carried her off. You must find him and her. A train leaves for New York in half an hour. Come back with me and help look for her. It will count toward your regeneration." He glanced at his watch abstractedly. He even smiled in a sickly way as he said, "You timed your visit well." "Yes, a woman has intuition, you know. It takes the place of brains. I shall await you in the hall. Now don't be stupid and think of revolvers and poisons and things. You will end by blessing me for my interference. Will you be ready in 5 minutes?" She sat in the lounge, and soon saw some baggage descending. Then Michael John joined her. She went to the office and asked for a telegraph form. The senator had followed. "What are you going to do?" he asked suspiciously. "I'm wiring Rex to say that you and I are travelling to New York together, and advising him to suspend operations until we arrive. That will be helpful. You will not be tempted to act foolishly, and he will not do anything to prejudice your future actions." He gave her a wrathful glance. Mrs. Carshaw missed no point. A man driven to desperation might be tempted to bring about an accident, if he fancied he could save himself in that way. But, clever as a mother scheming for her son's welfare proved herself, there was one thing she could not do. Neither she nor any other human being can prevent the unexpected from happening occasionally. Sound judgment and astute planning will often gain a repute for divination, yet the prophet is decried at times. Steingall had discovered this, and Mrs. Carshaw experienced it now. It chanced that Mick the Wolf, lying in Gateway House on a bed of pain, his injuries aggravated by the struggle with the detective, and his temper soured by Rachel Crake's ungracious ministrations, found his thoughts dwelling on the gentle girl who had forgotten her own sorrows and tended him, her enemy. Such moments come to every man, no matter how vile he may be, and this lone wolf was a social castaway from whom, during many years, all decent-minded people had averted their faces. His slow-moving mind was apt to be dominated by a single idea. He understood enough of the Costa Rican project to grasp the essential fact that there was money in it for all concerned, and money honestly earned, if honesty be measured by the ethics of the stock manipulator. He realized, too, that neither Vholes nor Rachel Crake could be moved by argument, and he rightly estimated Fowl as a weak-minded nonentity. So he slowly hammered out a conclusion, and, having appraised it in his narrow circle of thought, determined to put it into effect. An East Orange doctor, who had received his instructions from the police, paid a second visit to Mick the Wolf shortly before the hour of Mrs. Carshaw's arrival in Atlantic City. "Well, how is the arm feeling now?" he said pleasantly when he entered the patient's bedroom. The answer was an oath. "That will never do. Cheerfulness is the most important factor in healing. Ill temper causes jerky movements, and careless—" "Oh, shucks," came the growl. "Say, listen, boss. I've been broke up twice over a slip of a girl. I've had enough of it. The whole darn thing is a mistake. I want to end it, and I don't give a hoorah in Hades who knows. Just tell her friends that if they look for her on board the steamer Wild Duck, loadin' at Smith's Pier in the East River, they'll either find her or strike her trail. That's all. Now fix these bandages, for my arm's on fire." The doctor wisely put no further questions. He dressed the wounded limb and took his departure. A policeman in plain clothes, hiding in a neighbouring barn, saw him depart and hailed him. "Any news, Doc?" "Yes," was the reply. "If my information is correct, you'll not be kept there much longer." He motored quickly to the police station. Within the hour, Carshaw, with frowning face and dreams of wreaking physical vengeance on the burly frame of Vholes, was speeding across New York with Steingall in his recovered car. He simply hungered for a personal combat with the man who had inflicted such sufferings on his beloved Winifred. The story told by Polly Barnard, and supplemented by Petch, revealed very clearly the dastardly trick practised by Vholes the previous evening, while the dodge of smearing out two of the figures on the automobile's license plate explained the success attained in traversing the streets unnoticed by the police. Steingall was inclined to theorize. "The finding of the car puzzled me at first, I admit," he said. "Now, assuming that Mick the Wolf has not sent us off on a wild goose chase, the locality of the steamer explains it. Vowles drove all the way to the east side, quitted the car in the neighbourhood of the pier, deposited Miss Bartlett on board the vessel under some plausible pretext, and actually risked the return journey into the only part of New York where the missing auto might not be noticed at once. He's a bold rogue, and no mistake." But Carshaw answered not. The chief glanced at him sideways and smiled. There was a lowering fire in his companion's eyes that told its own story. Thenceforth the run was taken in silence. But Steingall had decided on his next move. When they neared Smith's Pier, Carshaw wished to drive straight there. "Nothing of the sort," was the sharp official command. "We have failed once. Perhaps it was my fault. This time there shall be no mistakes. Turn along the next street to the right. The precinct station is 3 blocks down." Somewhat surprised by Steingall's tone, the other obeyed. At the station house, a policeman, called from the men's quarters, where he was quietly reading and smoking, stated that he was on duty in the neighbourhood between 8 o'clock the previous evening and 4 o'clock that morning. He remembered seeing a car, similar to the one standing outside, pass about 9:15 p.m. It contained 2 people, he believed, but could not be sure, as the screens were raised owing to the rain. He did not see the car again. Some drunken sailors required detention during the small hours. The local police captain and several men in plain clothes were asked to assemble quietly on Smith's Pier. A message was sent to the river police, and a launch requisitioned to patrol near the Wild Duck. Finally, Steingall, who was a born strategist, and whose long experience of cross-examining counsel rendered him wary before he took irrevocable steps in cases such as this, where a charge might fail on unforeseen grounds, made inquiries from a local ship's chandler as to the Wild Duck, her cargo, and her destination. There was no secret about her. She was loaded with stores for Costa Rica. The consignees were a syndicate, and both Carshaw and Steingall recognized its name as that of the venture in which Senator Meiklejohn was interested. "Do you happen to know if there is anyone on board looking after the interests of the syndicate?" asked the detective. "Yes. A big fellow has been down here once or twice. He's going out as the manager, I guess. His name was, let me see now—" "Vowles," suggested Steingall. "No, that wasn't it. Oh, I've got it. Vane it was." Carshaw, dreadfully impatient, failed to understand all this preliminary survey, but the detective had no warrant, and ship's captains become crusty if their vessels are boarded in a peremptory manner without justification. Moreover, Steingall quite emphatically ordered Carshaw to remain on the wharf while he and others went on board. "You want to strangle Vowles, if possible," he said. "From what I've heard of him, he would meet the attempt squarely, and you two might do each other serious injury. I simply refuse to permit any such thing. You have a much more pleasant task awaiting you when you meet the young lady. No one will say a word if you hug her as hard as you like." Carshaw, agreeing to aught but delay, promised ruefully not to interfere. When the river police were at hand, A nod brought several powerfully built officers closing in on the main gangway of the Wild Duck. The police captain, in uniform, accompanied Steingall on board. A deckhand hailed them and asked their business. "I want to see the captain," said the detective. "There he is, boss, looking at you from the chart house now." They glanced up toward a red-faced, hectoring sort of person who regarded them with evident disfavour. Some ships, loading for Central American ports at out-of-the-way wharves, do not want uniformed police on their decks. The two climbed an iron ladder. Men at work in the forehold ceased operations and looked up at them. Their progress was followed by many interested eyes from the wharf. The captain glared angrily. He, too, had noted the presence of the stalwart contingent near the gangway, nor had he missed the police boat. "What the—" he commenced, but the detective's stern question stopped an outburst. "Have you a man named Voles or Vane on board?" "Mr. Vane, yes." "Did he bring a young woman to this ship late last night?" "I don't see—" "Let me explain, Captain. I'm from the Detective Bureau. The man I'm inquiring for is wanted on several charges." The steady official tone caused the skipper to think. Here was no cringing foreigner or labourer to be browbeaten at pleasure. "Well, I'm—" he growled. "Here, you!" roaring at a man beneath. "Go aft and tell Mr. Vane he's wanted on the bridge." The messenger vanished. "I assume there is a young lady on board?" went on Steingall. "I'm told so. I haven't seen her." "Surely you know everyone who has a right to be on the ship?" "Guess that's so, mister. And who has more right than the daughter of the man who puts up the dough for the trip? Strikes me you're making a hash of things. But here's Mr. Vane. He'll soon put you where you belong." Advancing from the after staterooms came Voles. He was looking at the bridge, but the police captain was hidden momentarily by the chart room. He gazed at Steingall with bold curiosity. He had a foot on the companion ladder when he heard a sudden commotion on the wharf. Turning, he saw Fowl, livid with terror, writhing in Carshaw's grasp. Then Voles stood still. The shades of night were drawing in, but he had seen enough to give him pause. Perhaps, too, other, less palpable shadows darkened his soul at that moment. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Bartlett Mystery by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Settlement. The chief disliked melodrama in official affairs. Any man, even a crook, ought to know when he is beaten and take his punishment with a stiff upper lip. But Voles's face was white, and in one of his temperament that was as ominous a sign as the bloodshot eyes of a wild boar. Steingall had hoped that Voles would walk quietly into the chart-room and, seeing the folly of resistance, yield to the law without a struggle. Perhaps, under other conditions, he might have done so. It was the coming of Fowl that had complicated matters. The strategic position was simple enough. Voles had the whole of the afterdeck to himself. In the river, unknown to him, was the police launch. On the wharf, plain in view, were several policemen whose clothes in no wise concealed their character. On the bridge, visible now, was the uniformed police captain. Above all, there was Fowl, wriggling in Carshaw's grasp, and pointing frantically at him. "Come right along, Mr. Vane," said Steingall encouragingly. "We'd like a word with you." The planets must have been hostile to the Michaeljohn family in that hour. Brother William was being badly handled by Mrs. Carshaw in Atlantic City, and brother Ralph was receiving a polite request to come upstairs and be cuffed. But Ralph Vane Michaeljohn faced the odds creditably. People said afterward that it was a pity he was such a fire-eater. Matters might have been arranged much more smoothly. As it was, he looked back, perhaps through a long vista of misspent years, and the glance was not encouraging. Of late his mind had dwelt, with somewhat unpleasant frequency, on the finding of a dead body in the quarry near his Vermont home. His first great crime had found him out when he was beginning to forget it. He had walked that moment from the presence of a girl whose sorrowful, frightened face reminded him of another long-buried victim of that quarry tragedy. He knew, too, that this girl had been defrauded by him and his brother of a vast sum of money, and a guilty conscience made the prospect blacker than it really was. And then he was a man of fierce impulses, of ungovernable rage, a very tiger when his baleful passions were stirred. A wave of madness swept through him now. He saw the bright prospect of an easily earned fortune ruthlessly replaced by a more palpable vision of prison walls and silent, whitewashed corridors. Perhaps the chair of death itself loomed through the red mist before his eyes. Yet he retained his senses sufficiently to note the police captain's slight signal to his men to come on board, and again he heard Steingall's voice. "Don't make any trouble, Voles. It'll be all the worse for you in the end." The detective's warning was not given without good cause. He knew the faces of men, and in the blazing eyes of this man he read a maniacal fury. Voles glanced toward the river. It was nearly night. He could swim like an otter. In the sure confusion he might. Then, for the first time, he noticed the police launch. His right hand dropped to his hip. "Ah, don't be a fool, Voles," came the cry from the bridge. "You're only making matters worse." A bitter smile creased the lips of the man who felt the world slipping away beneath him. His hand was thrust forward, not toward the occupants of the bridge, but toward the wharf. Fowle saw him and yelled. A report, and the yell merged into a scream of agony. Voles was sure that Fowle had betrayed him, and took vengeance. There was a deadly certainty in his aim. Steingall, utterly fearless when action was called for, swung himself down by the railings. He was too late. A second report, and Voles crumpled up. His bold spirit had not yielded, nor his hand failed him in the last moment of his need. A bullet was lodged in his brain. He was dead ere the huge body thudded on the deck. When Carshaw found Winifred in a cabin, to open the door they had to obtain the key from Voles' pocket, the girl was sobbing pitifully. She heard the revolver shots, and knew not what they betokened. She was so utterly shaken by these last dreadful hours that she could only cling to her lover and cry in a frightened way that went to his heart, "Oh, take me away, Rex! It was all my fault. Why did I not trust you? Please take me away." He fondled her hair, and endeavoured to kiss the tears from her eyes. "Don't cry, little one," he whispered. "All your troubles have ended now." It was a simple formula, but effective. When repeated often enough, with sufficiently convincing caresses, she became calmer. When he brought her on deck, all signs of the terrible scene enacted there had been removed. She asked what had caused the firing, and he told her that Voles was arrested. It was sufficient. So sensitive was she that the mere sound of the dead bully's name made her tremble. "I remember now," she whispered. "I was sure he had killed you. I knew you would follow me, Rex. When I saw you, I forgot all else in the joy of it." "Are you sure you're not injured?" At another time he would have laughed, but her worn condition demanded the utmost forbearance. "No, dearest," he assured her. "He did not even try to hurt me. Now let me take you to my mother." The captain, thoroughly scared by the events he had witnessed, came forward with profuse apologies and offers of the ship's hospitality. Carshaw felt that the man was not to blame, but the Wild Duck held no attractions for him. He hurried Winifred ashore. Steingall came with them. The district police would make the official inquiries as a preliminary to the inquest, which would be held next day. Carshaw must attend, but Winifred would probably be excused by the authorities. He conveyed this information in scraps of innuendo. Winifred did not know of Vol's death or the shooting of Fowle till many days had passed. Fowle did not die. He recovered after an operation and some months in a hospital. Then Carshaw befriended him, obtained a situation for him, and gave him money to start life in an honest way once more. There was another scene when Mrs. Carshaw brought Michael John to her apartment and found Rex and Winifred awaiting them. Winifred, of course, had never seen the senator, and there was nothing terrifying to her in the sight of a haggard, weary-looking elderly gentleman. She was far more fluttered by meeting Rex's mother, who figured in her mind as a domineering, cruel old lady, elegantly merciless, and gifted with a certain skill in torture by words. Mrs. Carshaw began to dispel that impression promptly. "My poor child," she cried, with a break in her voice, "what you have undergone! Can you ever forgive me?" Carshaw, ignoring Michael John, whispered to his mother that Winifred should be sent to bed. She was utterly worn out. One of the maids should sleep in her room in case she awoke in fright during the night. When left alone with Michael John, he intended to scarify the man's soul. But he was disarmed at the outset. The senator's spirit was broken. He admitted everything, said naught in palliation. He could have taken no better line. When Mrs. Carshaw hastened back, fearing lest her plans might be upset, she found her son giving Winifred's chief persecutor a stiff dose of brandy. The tragedy of Smith's Pier was allowed to sink into the obscurity of an ordinary occurrence. Fowle's unhappily timed appearance was explained by Rachel Craik when the frenzy at the news of Vol's death had subsided. A chuckling remark by Mick the Wolf that "there'd been a darn sight too much fuss about that slip of a girl, and he had fixed it," alarmed her. She sent Fowle at top speed to Smith's Pier to warn Vowles. He arrived in time to be shot for his pains. Carshaw and Winifred were married quietly. Their honeymoon consisted of the trip to Massachusetts, when he began work in the cotton mill. Michael John fulfilled his promise. When the Costa Rica cotton concession reached its zenith, he sold out, resigned his seat in the Senate, and transferred to Winifred railway cash and gilt-edged bonds to the total value of $500,000. So the young bride enriched her husband, but Carshaw refused to desert his business. He will die a millionaire, but he hopes to live like one for a long time. Petch and Jim fought over Polly. There was talk about it in East Orange, and Polly threw both over. The latest gossip is that she is going to marry a police inspector. Mrs. Carshaw, senior, still visits her dear friend, Helen Tower. Both of them speak highly of Michael John, who lives in strict seclusion. He is very wealthy. Since he ceased to strive for gold, it has poured in on him. Winifred secured an allowance for Rachel Craik sufficient to live on, and Mick the Wolf, whose arm was never really sound again, was given a job on the Long Island estate as a watcher. Quite recently, when the young couple came into New York for a weekend's shopping, rendered necessary by the establishment of day and night nurseries, they entertained Steingall and Clancy at dinner in the Biltmore. Naturally, at one stage of a pleasant meal, the talk turned on those eventful months, October and November 1913. As usual, Clancy waxed sarcastic at his chief's expense. "He's as vain as a star actor in the movies," he cackled. "Hogs all the camera stuff. Wouldn't give me even a flash when the big scene was put on." Steingall pointed a fat cigar at him. "Do you know what happened to a frog when he tried to emulate a bull?" he said. "I know what happened to a bull one night in East Orange," came the ready retort. "The solitary slip in an otherwise unblemished career," sighed the chief. "Make the most of it, little man. If I allowed myself to dwell on your many blunders, I'd lie down and die." Winifred never really understood these two. She thought their bickering was genuine. "Why," she cried, "you are wonderful, both of you! From the very beginning you peered into the souls of those evil men. You, Mr. Clancy, seemed to sense a great mystery the moment you heard Rachel Craik speak to the Senator outside the club that night. As for you, Mr. Steingall, do you know what the lawyers told Rex and me soon after our marriage?" "No, ma'am." "They said that if you hadn't sent Rex's mother to Atlantic City, we might never have recovered a cent of the stolen money. Sheer bluff, they called it. We would have had the greatest difficulty in establishing a legal case." Steingall weighed the point for a moment. "Sometimes I'm inclined to think that the police know more about human nature than any other set of men," he said at last, evidently choosing his words with care. "Perhaps I might except doctors. They, too, see us as we are. But the dry legal mind does not allow sufficiently for what is called, in everyday speech, a guilty conscience. In this case, these people knew they had done you and your father and mother a great wrong, and that knowledge was never absent from their thoughts. It coloured every word they uttered, governed every action. That's a heavy handicap, ma'am. It's the deciding factor in the never-ending struggle between the police and the criminal classes. The most callous crook walking Broadway in freedom to-night, a man who would scoff at the notion that he is bothered by any conscience at all, never passes a policeman without an instinctive sense of danger. And that is what beats him in the long run. Crime may be a form of lunacy. Indeed, I look on it in that light myself. But, luckily for mankind, crime cannot stifle conscience." The chief's tone had become serious. He appeared to awake to its gravity when he found the young wife's eyes fixed on his with a certain awe. He broke off the lecture suddenly. "Why," he cried, smiling broadly, and jerking the cigar toward Clancy, "why, ma'am, if we cops hadn't some sort of a pull, what chance would a shrimp like him have against any one of real intelligence?" "That's what he regards as handing me a lemon for my orange," grinned Clancy. Winifred laughed. The curtain can drop on the last act of her adventures to the mirthful music of her happiness. End of chapter 27. Recording by Kirsten Wever. End of The Bartlett Mystery by Tracy.